The horrors of the Soviet-Afghan War are well catalogued, including Hind gunships leveling villages, butterfly mines seeded across farmland, and 1 million civilians displaced. But there was another kind of horror that history rarely examines. What happened when the fighting closed to arm's length? What follows is difficult to stomach. First, we will show you what dragged the most mechanized army on Earth into combat so ancient it barely required a firearm. On December 12, 1979, the Soviet Politburo gathered in Brezhnev's office to authorize a military intervention in Afghanistan. The signature on the memo, Chernenko's in blue ink, joined those of Andropov, Ustinov, and Gromyko. The language was clinical: a limited operation, rapid deployment, objectives to be achieved in 3 weeks. The document, later catalogued in the GARF archive, set a tone of certainty. Soviet doctrine, shaped by decades of war games and parade ground rehearsals, prescribed the use of operational maneuver groups, self-contained mechanized columns designed to cut through enemy resistance with speed and firepower. The plan called for isolating Soviet troops from the unreliable Afghan army, ensuring that no mixing would dilute the Red Army's effectiveness. The timeline was explicit. Within 21 days, Kabul would be secured, a new government installed, and Soviet forces would begin withdrawal preparations. The logic was as much political as military. Intelligence briefings warned of Western influence over Hafizullah Amin, but the solution was framed as a matter of discipline and tempo. Orders circulated through the general staff, referencing the 3-week window with bureaucratic confidence. Ceremony bled into calculation. KGB cables advised that officers appear in dress uniforms for the seizure of the presidential palace, a gesture meant to signal both control and impermanence. A color photograph, later smuggled into the Bukovsky archive, captured a handful of Soviet officers standing in full regalia before the Tajbeg Palace. The image, dated December 26, was never meant for public release. Official press photos would show field uniforms, but the ceremonial intent lingered behind closed doors. The machinery of deep battle doctrine was in motion, insulated from the reality waiting beyond the border. The promise of a quick, decisive campaign hung over the operation, untested. The countdown had begun. Steel and doctrine arrived together at the Afghan border. The Mi-24 high-end, its fuselage armored to withstand heavy machine gun fire, circled above the convoys. Its Yak B 12.7mm chin-mounted Gatling gun could fire up to 4,000 rounds per minute, while rocket pods lined both stub wings. The Hind was designed to deliver both firepower and infantry, carrying up to 8 troops into the heart of a battle. Soviet planners called it a flying tank, a weapon to break resistance before it formed. On the ground, BMP infantry fighting vehicles and T-72 main battle tanks formed the backbone of the operational maneuver groups. The BMP, amphibious and fast, carried a 73mm smoothbore gun and anti-tank guided missiles. T-72s, fielded since 1973, boasted a 125mm cannon, composite armor, and a diesel engine built for long-range thrust. Columns of these machines moved in tightly coordinated convoys, each vehicle spaced for mutual support and maximum firepower. Beneath the treads and rotors, another weapon waited. The PFM-1 butterfly mine, molded from bright green plastic, weighed less than 80 grams and contained just enough explosive to maim. Its low metal content made it nearly invisible to standard detectors. Soviet manuals described it as an area denial tool. International casualty tables recorded hundreds of civilian injuries, many of them children who mistook the mines for toys. Humanitarian agencies would later document over 1,200 casualties linked to PFM-1s by the end of the decade. Each platform, each weapon, embodied the logic of deep battle theory. Together, they formed a mechanized package meant to force the war into the open, to keep the enemy at a distance, to deny sanctuary. But the mountains ahead offered no open ground, and the first convoys had not yet met the terrain that would test every assumption. The arsenal waited, poised for a kind of war it was never meant to fight. The first convoys bound for the Salang Pass moved in tight, doctrinal columns, 3 meters between vehicles, machine guns trained outward, radios humming with coded brevity. What they met was not an enemy massed in open ground, but a geometry of death. Lead and rear vehicles were hit simultaneously with RPG-7 rounds, the column trapped in a funnel of fire and rock. Survivors later recalled the silence after the first blasts, broken only by the hiss of burning fuel and the metallic clatter of ammunition cooking off inside a stalled BMP. Official 40th Army loss ledgers record the opening tally: 3 BMP-1 vehicles and a T-62 destroyed. Near Mirza Ali checkpoint, 12 men killed or wounded in under 20 minutes. In the Panjshir offensives that followed, casualty rates soared. By 1982, some Soviet infantry regiments reported annual losses above 30%, a figure that never appeared in Moscow's planning tables. The kill zone was no longer a theoretical construct, it was a measured corridor of attrition, repeated on every mountain road. Doctrine had promised maneuver and shock. The mountains delivered only slow, unanswered loss. Each ambush forced a recalculation, but the ledgers kept growing. The next convoy would face the same road, the same silence, and no assurance of return. Altitude became the first silent adversary. At 3,500 meters and above, the Mi-24 Hin's twin turbines lost up to 40% of their lift. Engine charts from Bagram Air Base show that every 1,000 meters of ascent stripped away another 10 to 15% of available power, not just in helicopters, but in the T-62 and T-72 tanks grinding up the Salang and Panjshir passes. Diesel engines sputtered, track links snapped, and maintenance downtime doubled in the thin mountain air. Gunnery tables written for the plains of Eastern Europe proved useless. The T-62's main gun, limited to a maximum elevation of 20 degrees, could not reach fighters perched on valley walls hundreds of meters above. Infantry fighting vehicles fared no better, their smoothbore guns missing more than 1/3 of their shots in narrow corridors where the angle was simply too steep. Soviet fieldcraft notes later declassified record the shift. Desantniks, stripped of their armored shell, began to move on foot, carrying SVD rifles and RPG launchers, learning to climb and crawl rather than ride. The machines that defined Soviet doctrine, airlift, armor, shock, were reduced to dead weight by the very air they tried to conquer. The next adaptation would not be technological at all. Mud brick chalets rose from the valley floors, their walls 60 centimeters thick, built to outlast both siege and shell. Each compound was a fortress. Doorways were barely shoulder wide, roofs were flat and layered with stone, and firing slits were hidden in shadow. Soviet demolition teams logged the same measurements in every report. Walls too dense for RPGs to breach, interiors compartmented to trap intruders in a maze of darkness. Where the ground allowed, the Mujahideen tunneled downward, linking cellars and storerooms into a warren that could swallow a platoon. Above, the Zhawar Kili cave complex stretched for 11 kilometers through limestone, its passages reinforced with timber and scavenged rebar, its air thick with the smell of diesel and gun oil. Night belonged to the defenders. Ammunition and water moved by mule along goat trails that snaked above Soviet line of sight, invisible even to helicopter crews. The Soviets marked these routes as impassable. Mujahideen fieldcraft made them lifelines, silent, unbroken, immune to the logic of firepower. The terrain itself became an accomplice, and every approach promised a new disappearance. Jezils, black powder scars burned into their stocks, surfaced from decades of dust. Lee Enfields, stamped with faded British crests, passed from grandfather to grandson, returned to mountain passes where Soviet steel could not follow. The Patu, part walking stick, part club, waited beside the door, its weight familiar in the hand. These were the weapons that met the Red Army when the machines failed. Soviet manuals had no answer for a muzzle flash from a cellar slit, or for the blade in a night corridor. By 1984, psychiatric files in the TSAMO archive listed new vocabulary: chronic insomnia, refusal to fire, nighttime terror without electric light. The diagnosis read Afghanism. 3,000 documented cases in a single year. Conscripts from Central Asia, Faces almost indistinguishable from the men in the hills began to trade food, miss shots, or vanish into the dusk. Meanwhile, the sky grew hostile. The CIA's own logbook counted 269 aircraft lost to Stinger missiles. Each hit a lesson that altitude and armor meant nothing here. Old tools, frayed mines, and a war shrinking down to the length of an arm. The next raid would not wait for sunrise. Ali Khel, Paktia Province. For 3 nights in May 1983, a team of 45 Mujahideen crept along a goat trail, moving only in darkness, mules burdened with RPG-7s and satchel charges. No fires, no radios, not a word above a whisper. At 2 a.m., they reached a drainage culvert behind the Soviet garrison, barely 80 centimeters wide. Fighters stripped off their vests and crawled single file, boots scraping stone, knives strapped to wrists. The breach came in silence. 2 Soviet sentries were killed before they could raise an alarm. Explosives shattered the inner door, hurling splinters through the corridor. The firefight that followed lasted less than 5 minutes. In the maze of stone-walled rooms, rifles became useless. Bayonets, patu clubs, and fists decided who lived. At 4:30, a Soviet desantnik patrol rounded a corner, 20 men facing the Mujahideen at arm's length. For 90 seconds, neither side fired. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, both withdrew into separate darkness. By the time Soviet helicopters arrived, the raiders were gone. 8 Soviet soldiers were dead, 15 Mujahideen left behind. The only trace, blood pooled on cold stone, and a garrison that would never again trust the night. Steel Doctrine meets Stone Mountain. The manuals never mention terror in the dark. Today, modern armies still write for open fields, not alleys or caves. The lesson endures. Technology can't insulate flesh from fear. War always finds the weakest seam. What would your doctrine overlook?